Elden Ring, the most anticipated game of 2022, has finally arrived, with a world so large that the average completion time is about 50 hours, with full game playthroughs taking upwards of 70. With so much to do, you're probably thinking the speedrun must be fairly long, but what if I told you that not only has a speedrun already been completed, but that it was done deathless? Just 7 days after the game's release, Niko Bellic would route and complete a deathless run of the game that he completed in just over 2.5 hours. Today we're going to learn about how he planned this run, what challenges he faced along the way, and what this means for a no-hit run. I hope you enjoy today's video. To understand the deathless run, we need to understand a couple of systems at work in Elden Ring, and the first is the required bosses. The game sports a total of 83 bosses that's broken down into field bosses, mini-bosses, and main bosses that rule over a particular area, and fortunately, only 12 of these bosses are required for progression. This makes the route very straightforward, so Niko started creating a path that made killing these bosses as efficient as possible, while keeping survivability in mind, and it starts at the character creation screen. There are 10 different classes to pick from, but for a deathless run, there were 3 options that Niko thought would excel at staying alive: the Vagabond, the Astrologer, and the Prisoner. The Prisoner starts with a buckler that allows you to parry bosses to set up riposts, but the final boss takes 4 parries for 1 riposte, so for time and survivability concerns, this wouldn't do. The Astrologer is a ranged magic-using class, and there's a spell not too far out of the way in the Celia Crystal Caves that he thought would make this the premier class for completing a deathless run. But in true hardcore Souls player fashion, he decided that this would make the challenge too easy, so he settled on the Vagabond. The Vagabond has the highest vigor stat of any class, which makes survivability much easier with its large HP pool, but the most attractive feature is its starting weapon: the common longsword. The longsword has decent damage scaling if you focus on increasing strength and dexterity, but its most important attribute is its ability, Square Off. Square Off has 2 options once activated. The most important for the deathless run is an upward strike that allows you to stagger bosses, which lets you set up riposte combos to get in massive damage. With the character selected, we're ready to start, and out of the gate, we have the Grafted Scion fight. The strat for this boss is quite complex. Okay, you're probably thinking, did he just die? While technically you may be correct, a death is required in the starting area for progression, and since this doesn't trigger the "you died" text, it's permissible in the context of the run. Once the totally not a death in a deathless run is completed, we're ready to take on the first open world in the Souls series, which makes the first priority finding a way to travel as fast as possible. Luckily, there's a mount named Torrent available early on, and once it's acquired, we'll make a beeline to the Limgrave tunnels. The tunnels let us collect smithing stone shards to upgrade our weapon for late game scaling, but it's not without risk, as you also need to survive as you'll aggro every enemy in the tunnels on your way through. You'd think after aggroing an entire dungeon that getting out of it would be a problem, but the Memory of Grace starting item lets you warp to the last site of grace you visited at the cost of all your runes. And since you've yet to collect any, this is essentially a get out of jail free card. Having no runes won't be the case for long, because this isn't a level 0 run, and Niko found a way to cheese a field boss into jumping off a cliff, which gives us 41,000, and shortly after, it's time to spend these on stat increases. Strength takes the majority of the upgrades, with the leftovers going into dexterity to help maximize weapon damage, and then it's back on the road, because we're going to skip farming in the starting area to head for bluer oceans, or in this case, the second area, the Urnia of the Lakes. This area offers better upgrade materials for our weapon, and after some intense routing to optimize farming, it's time to fight the first boss of the run, the Crystallian, in the Raya Lucaria Crystal Tunnel. While the Crystallian isn't a required boss, he drops the Smithing Stone Bell, which allows you to buy more powerful smithing stones from the Twin Maiden husks at Roundtable Hold, so it's more time efficient to defeat him than to go out of the way farming more stones. The Crystallian demonstrates perfectly why the Square Off ability is such a great asset to the run, as it sets up riposts for huge damage to quickly dispatch of the otherwise tough encounter. You'll notice that Square Off itself doesn't do much damage, but its ability to stagger, combined with a summon, allow the fight to end in just under a minute. After the fight, it's finally time to upgrade our items, but getting to the blacksmith isn't a walk in the park, and once again, you need to aggro a dungeon. But with a bunch of souls, Niko can't use the Memory of Grace or he loses them. So in order to survive, he saves and quits, which drops aggro when he loads back in. Shortly after the near death, we finally arrive at the blacksmith, and the 40 minutes of farming pays off big, as the longsword gets upgraded all the way to plus 14. And if you're wondering what this means in terms of damage output, look no further than the next boss, Margit the Fell Omen. Margit is the first progression boss encountered in the run, and while he may seem intimidating, the upgraded sword is going to put in work for this fight. With large telegraphed attacks, this battle is over before it starts, as Niko has Margit below 25% before Phase 2 even triggers. In all, the fight is over in about 50 seconds. The run starts to pick up pace at this point, and he makes quick work of Godric the Grafted before coming to the first boss that almost ends the run, the Red Wolf of Radagon. With long sweeping attacks, it's hard to find a safe spot around the Red Wolf, and Niko learns this very quickly as he's down to just a sliver of health, while the boss is barely below 75%. With nerves of steel, he avoids further harm and relies on the massive damage of Square Off to get him through the fight. Then he's off to kill more progression bosses. To avoid making this a summary of every boss fight, we'll look at Rennala and then two of the more difficult fights, because the strategies Niko came up with to solve them are quite interesting. For the Rennala fight, you normally have to find the students with a glowing aura and hit them once to dispel it. When the auras are dispelled, Rennala will fall to the ground, and you have some time to get damage in. In a casual playthrough, this cycle usually repeats with Rennala casting spells on you as her HP gets lower, but with the power of Square Off, we're into Phase 2 after just one cycle. Her second form is one of the most beautiful fights in the entire game, but if you stop to appreciate it for even a second, it will be over, because Rennala chains together some nasty spells. Unlike the Red Wolf fight, you'll see Niko use a flask to replenish HP in this fight, as her patterns and projectiles can be very unpredictable. Square Off is still the attack of choice, but due to her ability to create space, it's hard to find a good spot to use it, and Niko resorts to basic attacks to finish her off. The run after Rennala isn't a straight boss grind. It does involve routing for upgrade materials, so the longsword scales better into the late game. But the most important decision that Niko made was to clear the ruin-strewn precipice to gain access to the Atlas Plateau instead of using the Grand Lift of Deathless. To activate the Grand Lift, you're required to collect 2 halves of a medallion, which unsurprisingly takes a lot of time, but there is an alternate route to the plateau, and that's going through the precipice. But this has its own pros and cons. The precipice has a lot of upgrade stones, but they're guarded by a ton of enemies, so it's not a free lunch of materials. And to literally top it off, waiting for you at the end is a boss, Magma Worm Makar. Despite it being filled with enemies and a boss, it's faster to take this route than it is to gather the medallion pieces and activate the lift. And with the added bonus of getting a ton of upgrade materials, the risk is well worth the reward in this case. And we're now in the Atlas Plateau. The plateau has 2 field bosses that Niko kills. The first is a rematch with Margit to get the Viridian Talisman he drops for increased stamina, and the second is the Draconic Tree Sentinel to get access to the Royal Capital. This is where the run starts to turn into a boss rush, as we're an hour and 20 minutes in, and only 4 of the required 12 bosses have been defeated. So let's take a look at a couple of the harder fights, the Godskin Duo and Huara Lu. The Souls series is famous for its difficult double boss fights, and Elden Ring would be no exception with the Godskin Duo. This fight is unique in that both enemies have their own health bar in addition to the boss meter, and if one of them dies before the boss bar is depleted, they will resurrect after a short time. This makes managing the 2 Godskins a difficult but necessary part of the fight, and the main strategy is to isolate one of them while you DPS it down, which isn't the easiest of tasks since they both have powerful ranged attacks. Niko brought an ace up his sleeve for this fight, however. He made a stop at the Warmaster Shack for the Stormblade skill, which gives you a ranged attack of your own. But even with this, the fight isn't a cakewalk. The biggest problem is the larger god skin, as he has a nasty lunge attack that's difficult to dodge, and the worst thing he can do is roll out harder than Whitney's Miltank that hits for about 2/3 of your HP. But unlike the Gen 2 Pokemon games, this can be avoided by standing behind a pillar. Niko ends up killing the larger god skin 3 times throughout the fight, and when he downs the slender one for the first time, the boss bar still has some HP left. So Miltank revives and he finishes the fight from there, which leaves some weapon upgrades and the last few bosses, but more importantly, Huara Lu, the second phase of the Godfrey rematch. Huara has a lot of different attacks, and compared to Godfrey's long animations, he's much more fast-paced, and there are 2 attacks in particular that you need to watch out for. The first are his various grab attacks that can chunk 70 to 80% of your health bar if he gets his hands on you. These can be dodged with a roll, but the second ability is a bit more annoying. Periodically, he will slam the ground and start a huge AoE attack. Your option is normally to get out of its range, but Niko noticed that if you stand on the darker area of ground, you will only take 30 to 50% of your HP, so if you can't dodge it, you can mitigate it. Like the other bosses, Squareoff puts in work for most of the damage, and once he's defeated, the Elden Beast is the only thing that stands between you and a completed Deathless speedrun, with Niko's world first Deathless run clocking in at just over 2.5 hours. This is an impressive feat in and of itself, especially when you consider that Niko routed and completed the run 1 week after launch. It's even more astounding that he didn't have outside help. He wasn't a part of the Speed Souls Discord where a lot of skips in theory crafting are posted. Instead, he was in the official Elden Ring Discord, where speedrunning isn't the focus. This is mind-blowing, as typically, routing for these kinds of runs is a collaborative effort that involves multiple people, and there are likely 2 questions that are sticking out in your mind right now. Where were the game-breaking skips, and when will a no-hit run be completed? Had Niko known about the Speed Soul server, he estimates that about 30 minutes could have been saved using some of the strats and routing the other speedrunners were working on, because there were plenty of discoveries found, from boss cheese strats to wrong warps, and even ways to unload boss AI. If you want to see those explained, you'll have to stay tuned, because next time we'll be diving in to the any percent run for Elden Ring, which has already been beaten in under 1 hour. But what about a no-hit run? On March 9th, just 6 days after Niko's Deathless run, the Happy Hob would complete a 13-hit run, so I don't think a no-hit run is far behind, and it's likely one will be finished before the end of the month. But there's one thing left to cover. I've launched a shorts channel for bite-sized news updates that covers things too small for a full video or that fall outside of the scope of what we cover here. It's a wider variety of topics, so be sure to check it out. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.